Now we discussed about oogenesis. Oogenesis also known as female gametogenesis. This process starts from fetal stage and continue through puberty and then complete at the time of fertilization. It is an elaborate process. Now we can show what are the steps. This is the flow chart of oogenesis. It starts from fetal stage and complete at the time of fertilization. Oogenesis initiate during embryonic stage. Couple of million gamete mother cells or oogonias are formed in each ovary. There are 2 ovaries. No more oogonia are formed or added after birth. Oogenesis initiated during fetal stage. Then no more oogonia are formed or added after birth. No more oogonia are formed or added after birth. Then in fetus, prophase 1 of meiosis. Prophase 1 of meiosis. We already discussed about the different stages of meiosis in our channel. You can utilize it. Now in fetal stage, the prophase 1 of meiosis. Prophase 1 of meiosis, that is reduction division, take place and temporarily arrested at the stage. That is, these cells are called primary oocytes. Primary oocytes are formed at the stage of prophase 1. At the stage of prophase 1 of meiosis. Prophase 1 of meiosis, that is reduction division. Now once more, oogenesis initiated during the embryonic stage. Couple of million gamete mother cells, that is diploid, also known as oogonia, are formed in each ovary. No more oogonia are formed or added after birth. In fetal stage, prophase 1 of meiosis, that is the reduction division, take place and temporarily arrested at that stage, that these cells are called primary oocytes. Next stage. Each primary oocyte surrounded by a layer, that is known as granulosa, then called primary follicle. Next. Each primary oocyte surrounded by a layer of granulosa cells. Then called primary follicle. primary follicle. Number of follicles degenerate before puberty. Number of such type of follicles degenerate or perished before puberty, that is at the phase of adolescence. Then up to 60,000 to 80,000 primary follicles with primary oocytes are left in each ovary. This is the time of birth. At the time of birth, up to 60 to 80,000 primary follicles with primary oocytes. The primary oocytes are covered. The primary follicles with primary oocytes are left in each ovary. At the time of birth, $60,000 to 80,000 primary follicles, with primary oocytes. Left in each ovary. There are 2 ovaries. Then next step, more layers of granulosa cells. Again, more layers of granulosa cells and a new theca called secondary follicles. Then the formation of secondary follicles. Here more layers of granulosa cells and a new theca are formed, that is known as secondary follicles. Next stage, more layers of granulosa covering granulosa cells surrounded and a new theca called secondary follicles. More layers of granulosa cells are formed and surrounded. This theca is called secondary follicles. Next stage, at the time of puberty. Secondary follicles transform into tertiary follicles. At the time of puberty, secondary follicles transformed into to tertiary follicles. This tertiary follicle is characterized by a fluid-filled cavity called antrum. These tertiary follicles characterized by a fluid-filled cavity. Called antrum. Next step, the theca layer is organized into two. The theca layer is then organized into two: inner theca interna and outer theca externa. The theca layer is organized into two, that is inner theca interna and outer theca externa. Now the meiosis 1 stage is completed. Now the meiosis 1 of reduction division, meiosis 1 stage completed. Next stage. It is important the product of meiosis 1 is one polar body and a secondary oocyte. After the completion of meiosis 1, the important character is the products of meiosis, that is after the completion of meiosis 1, the products are one polar body and one secondary oocyte. At the time of completion of meiosis 1, there are two products. There are two products, that is one polar body and one secondary oocyte. At the time of meiosis 1 completion, there are two products are formed, one polar body and one secondary oocyte. These polar body and secondary oocytes are unequal in size. This polar body degenerate and the secondary oocyte is haploid. The secondary oocyte is haploid and polar body degenerate. This is the reduction division, completion of reduction, meiosis 1. The polar body may or may not divide or perish. There is no importance in case of polar body. The tertiary follicle further change into mature follicle or Graafian follicle. The tertiary follicle further change into mature follicle or Graafian follicle. The secondary oocyte forms a new membrane called zona pellucida. The polar body degenerate the secondary oocyte is haploid in case. Secondary oocyte is haploid, that is the reduction completes. Polar body may or may not divide or perish. The tertiary follicle further change into mature follicle, that is also known as Graafian follicle. The tertiary follicle, that is the covering. The tertiary follicle further change into mature follicle, that is also known as Graafian follicle. The secondary oocyte, that is the product of meiosis 1. The follicle is the covering, and the secondary oocyte, that is the product of prophase 1. The secondary oocyte form a new membrane called zona pellucida. The secondary oocyte forms a new membrane called zona pellucida. At the time of ovulation, Graafian follicle rupture and release secondary oocyte. At the time of ovulation, that is the stage of puberty. At the time of ovulation, Graafian follicle ruptures, that is the covering or follicle rupture. Graafian follicle rupture and release, and secondary oocytes release, and secondary oocyte release. The meiosis 2 complete. Now the meiosis 2 complete. That is, a typical mitosis occur in secondary oocyte. Now at the time of completion of these steps, the meiosis 2 stage complete. We already discussed mitosis and meiosis in our channel. Now the meiosis 2 is also complete. That is, a typical mitosis occur in secondary oocyte. The meiosis 2 means a typical mitosis occur in secondary oocyte and form secondary polar body and ovum. That is, the secondary meiosis 2 means a typical mitosis. A typical mitosis occur in secondary oocyte and form secondary polar body and an haploid ovum. Ovum is already haploid. Secondary polar body. There are two polar bodies are formed, polar body plus ovum. This occur at the time of fertilization. These steps occur at the time of fertilization. Ovum formation and fertilization take place simultaneously. This step. This step occur at the time of fertilization. Ovum formation and fertilization take place simultaneously. Ovum formation and fertilization take place simultaneously. Once more, I explain detail in fast. Oogenesis initiate during the embryonic stage. Couple of million gamete mother cell or oogonia are formed in each ovary. No more oogonia are formed or added after birth. In fetus, prophase 1 of meiosis, that is reduction division, take place and temporarily arrested at this stage. That is, these cells are called primary oocytes. Then each primary oocyte surrounded by a layer. Layer means granulosous cells and then called primary oocyte, then called primary follicle. The primary oocyte surrounded by a layer of granulosous cells, then called the oocyte, then called primary follicle. Number of follicles degenerate before puberty. Up to 60 to 80,000 primary follicles with follicles means covering with primary oocyte are left in each ovary at the time of birth. Then more layers of granulosa cells and a new theca or pouch called secondary follicles. At the time of puberty, secondary follicles transform into tertiary follicle, which is characterized by a fluid-filled cavity called antrum. The theca layer is organized into two, inner theca interna and outer theca externa. Now the meiosis 1 stage completes. Then at the product of meiosis 1, that is two cells, that is one polar body and one secondary oocyte. This meiosis 1 division ends unequal. Polar body is minute and somewhat large secondary oocyte is formed. Polar body degenerate. The secondary oocyte, that is haploid polar body, may or may not divide or perish. The tertiary follicle further change into mature follicle. Follicles means covering. That the mature follicles is known as Graafian follicle. The secondary oocyte form a new membrane. The secondary oocyte also form a new membrane called zona pellucida. At the time of ovulation, Graafian follicle rupture and release secondary oocyte. The meiosis 2 now completes. That is atypical mitosis. Meiosis 2 means atypical mitosis occur in secondary oocyte and form secondary polar body and ovum. Ovum is also haploid. This occur at the time of fertilization. Ovum formation and fertilization take place simultaneously. Now we complete this part, that is oogenesis or female gametogenesis. If you like this portion, please like, share to your friends and also subscribe.